Welcome to the Story Lab. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's begin. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, gazing out at the Denver skyline. The city sprawled before me, a testament to human ambition and the rewards it could bring. My own journey from poverty to prosperity was etched into every gleaming skyscraper and bustling street below. "Mr. Thompson, your wife is on line 1. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. I turned from the window, straightening my tie as I moved to my desk. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll take it." Picking up the phone, I heard Angelina's familiar voice. "Blake, darling, don't forget we have the charity gala tonight." "Of course not," I replied, my tone measured. "I've already had my tuxedo pressed. How could I forget such an important event?" Angelina's laugh tinkled through the line. "Well, you've been so busy with work lately. I just wanted to make sure it hadn't slipped your mind." "Nothing slips my mind, Angelina. You know that." I paused, then added, "How are Lily and Ben doing?" "Oh, they're fine. The nanny took them to the park this afternoon. They should be home soon." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Good. I'll try to be home early to see them before we leave for the gala." "That would be nice," Angelina said, her voice softening. "They miss you, you know." A pang of guilt shot through me, but I pushed it aside. "I miss them too. I'll see you soon." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Angelina's voice had a distant quality to it, as if her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed it lately. I buzzed my assistant. "Sarah, can you get Paul Heller on the line for me?" "Right away, Mr. Thompson." While I waited for the call to connect, I pulled up the latest financial reports for Thompson Enterprises on my computer. The numbers were good, better than good. We were poised to acquire another tech startup, expanding our reach even further. "Blake, my friend," Paul's gruff voice came through the speaker. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I leaned back in my chair. "Paul, I need your expertise. Something doesn't feel right at home." There was a pause on the other end. "Angelina?" "Yeah," I sighed. "I can't put my finger on it, but something's changed. I need you to look into it." "Discreetly, of course." "Of course," Paul replied. "You know I've got your back, Blake. Always have, always will." I smiled, remembering our days in the military. "I know, Paul. That's why you're the only one I trust with this. I'll get right on it. You'll have my initial report by the end of the week." "Thanks, Paul. I owe you one." "Nah, we're even. Remember that time in Kandahar?" I chuckled. How could I forget? "All right, I'll talk to you soon." Hanging up, I turned back to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. I had built all of this from nothing, through sheer determination and a refusal to back down. I wouldn't let anyone take it away from me, not even Angelina. As I drove home in my sleek black Audi, I thought about how I'd met Angelina. It had been at a similar charity gala 5 years ago. She'd been stunning in a red dress, her blonde hair cascading down her back. I'd been immediately drawn to her, not just for her beauty, but for the sharp intelligence in her eyes. We'd married within 6 months, a whirlwind romance that had taken Denver's social scene by storm. The poor boy made good, marrying the society princess. It had seemed like a fairy tale. But fairy tales weren't real. I reminded myself as I pulled into our gated driveway. I'd learned that lesson early in life. As I walked through the front door, I heard the pitter-patter of little feet. "Daddy!" Lily cried, running towards me with her arms outstretched. I scooped her up, twirling her around. "Hey, princess, how was your day?" Ben toddled after his sister, his chubby hands reaching for me. I knelt down, pulling him into a hug with my free arm. "Park," Ben said proudly. "Swing." I grinned, ruffling his hair. "Did you go high on the swings, buddy?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Blake, you're home early." Angelina's voice floated down the staircase. I looked up to see her descending, already dressed for the gala in a shimmering gold gown. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. But as I watched her approach, I couldn't help but notice the slight tightness around her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. "I promised I'd try," I said, setting Lily down. "Thought I'd spend some time with the kids before we left." Angelina nodded, her eyes darting to the clock. "Well, we should probably get going soon." We don't want to be late. I frowned. We have time. I haven't seen the kids all day. She sighed, a barely perceptible sound. Of course. I'll just go check my makeup. As she turned to go back upstairs, I called after her. Is everything okay, Angelina? She paused, then looked back at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, darling. Why wouldn't it be? Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. I turned back to the kids, determined to make the most of our time together. Who wants to hear a story before Daddy has to go? Me. Me. Lily and Ben chorused. As I sat on the couch with them, reading their favorite book, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed world was about to be shaken to its core. The charity gala was in full swing when we arrived. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was awash in glittering lights and the sounds of clinking champagne glasses. I nodded to familiar faces as we made our way through the crowd, my hand resting lightly on the small of Angelina's back. Blake. Angelina. So glad you could make it. Charles Worthington, the host of the event, greeted us warmly. I shook his hand firmly. Wouldn't miss it, Charles. Thompson Enterprises is always happy to support such a worthy cause. Angelina smiled, but I noticed her eyes scanning the room. The decorations are lovely, Charles. You've outdone yourself this year. Charles beamed. Thank you, my dear. Oh, have you seen the new exhibit? We have some remarkable pieces on display tonight. Angelina's eyes lit up. No, we haven't had the chance yet. Where is it? Just through those doors, Charles pointed. You simply must see it. There's a new artist, Jonathan Parker, whose work is causing quite a stir. I felt Angelina tense slightly beside me. That sounds fascinating. Shall we take a look, Blake? I nodded, my eyes narrowing slightly at her sudden enthusiasm. Of course. Lead the way. As we entered the exhibit hall, I was immediately struck by the vibrant, chaotic energy of the paintings on display. They were a riot of color and emotion, raw and unrestrained. These are interesting, I said, trying to find a diplomatic way to express my distaste. Angelina, however, seemed entranced. They're incredible, she breathed, so full of life and passion. I frowned, looking at her. I didn't know you were such an art enthusiast. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. There's a lot you don't know about me, Blake. Before I could respond, a voice interrupted us. I'm glad you like them. We turned to see a man approaching us. He was tall and lean, with tousled dark hair and intense blue eyes. He moved with an easy grace, exuding confidence. Jonathan Parker, he introduced himself, his eyes fixed on Angelina. And you are? Angelina Thompson, my wife replied, her voice slightly breathless. And this is my husband, Blake. I extended my hand, gripping perhaps a bit too tightly. Nice to meet you, Mr. Parker. Your work is certainly provocative. Jonathan grinned, his gaze never leaving Angelina. That's the point, isn't it? Art should provoke, should make you feel something. And what does it make you feel, Mrs. Thompson? He asked, his voice low and intimate. Angelina blushed, a sight I hadn't seen in years. It makes me feel alive, she said softly, like there's a whole world of possibilities out there. I cleared my throat, uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. Well, it's certainly unique. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Parker, we should circulate. Jonathan nodded, his eyes still on Angelina. Of course. It was a pleasure meeting you both. I hope we'll have the chance to talk more about art soon, Mrs. Thompson. As we walked away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. The way Angelina had looked at Jonathan, the way she'd responded to his presence, it was all wrong. He seemed interesting, I said carefully as we made our way back to the main ballroom. Angelina nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, very interesting. His work is remarkable, don't you think? I shrugged. If you like that sort of thing. It's a bit chaotic for my taste. She looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in months. That's the problem, Blake. You always want everything neat and orderly. Sometimes life is chaotic. Sometimes that's beautiful. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. I built our life, Angelina. I gave you and the kids everything you could ever want. Is that not enough? She sighed, reaching for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. It's not about things, Blake. It's about feeling alive. I watched her as she downed the champagne in one long swallow, a growing sense of dread settling in my stomach. Something had shifted tonight, and I wasn't sure I could control where it was heading. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but notice how Angelina's eyes kept drifting back to the exhibit hall, how she seemed distracted and distant. When Jonathan Parker re-entered the main ballroom, her whole body seemed to come alive, as if she was suddenly more present in the moment. I excused myself, heading to the bar for a scotch. As I waited for my drink, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to Paul. Need you to look into someone. Jonathan Parker, artist. New in town. Something's not right. Paul's response came almost immediately. On it, boss. I'll have something for you by morning. I pocketed my phone, grabbing my scotch and turning back to the crowd. Angelina was nowhere to be seen. My eyes scanned the room, finally spotting her near the entrance to the exhibit hall. She was talking animatedly with Jonathan Parker, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she laughed at something he said. The scotch turned bitter in my mouth as I watched them. I'd built an empire from nothing, clawed my way up from poverty to become one of the most powerful men in Denver. I'd be damned if I'd let some smooth-talking artist threaten everything I'd worked for. As I made my way across the room towards them, I reminded myself of the lesson I'd learned long ago. Trust no one and always be prepared for betrayal. It had served me well in business, and now, it seemed, I'd need to apply it to my personal life as well. Angelina, I said, my voice cutting through their conversation. It's getting late. We should head home. She turned to me, surprise and something else. Was it guilt? Flashing across her face. Oh, Blake. Jonathan was just telling me about his upcoming show. It sounds fascinating. I forced a smile, extending my hand to Jonathan. I'm sure it does. But we really must be going. It was nice to meet you again, Mr. Parker. Jonathan shook my hand, his grip firm. Likewise, Mr. Thompson. I hope to see you both at the show. Angelina, I'll send you the details. I felt my jaw clench at his familiarity with my wife, but I kept my expression neutral. That won't be necessary. If we're interested, we'll find out the information ourselves. Angelina shot me a look, but I ignored it, placing my hand on her back to guide her towards the exit. As we drove home in tense silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a storm that threatened to tear apart everything I'd built. The next morning, I was in my office before dawn, unable to sleep after the events of the previous night. The city was just beginning to wake up, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. My phone buzzed with a message from Paul. Got some info on Parker. You're not going to like it. Coming over now? I leaned back in my chair, a grim smile on my face. Paul had always been efficient, one of the reasons I trusted him with sensitive matters like this. 20 minutes later, Paul walked into my office, a thick folder under his arm. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd been up all night. Morning, Blake, he said, dropping into the chair across from me. You want the good news or the bad news first? I poured us both a cup of coffee from the pot on my desk. Let's start with the bad. Paul nodded, opening the folder. Jonathan Parker isn't who he says he is. His real name is Jonathan Reeves. He's got a history of targeting wealthy women, seducing them, and then bleeding them dry financially. I felt my hand tighten around the coffee mug. And the good news? Good news is, we caught onto him early. He hasn't had time to do any real damage yet. I stood up, walking to the window. The city below was fully awake now, people hurrying to work, unaware of the drama unfolding in this office. What kind of evidence do we have? Paul pulled out several photographs. These are from his last job in San Francisco. The woman's name is Margaret Fulton, wealthy divorcee. Parker, or Reeves rather, seduced her, convinced her to invest in his art career, and then disappeared with nearly $2 million of her money. I looked at the photos. They showed Jonathan with an older woman, looking every bit the devoted lover. It made my stomach turn. And Angelina? I asked, dreading the answer. Paul hesitated. Blake, are you sure you want to see this? I turned to face him, my expression hard. Show me. He pulled out another set of photos. These were clearly taken recently, some even from last night's gala. They showed Angelina and Jonathan in various locations around Denver at cafes, in the park, entering an apartment building I didn't recognize. The apartment belongs to a friend of his, Paul explained. They've been meeting there for the past 2 weeks. I sat heavily in my chair, the evidence of my wife's betrayal laid out before me. How did I miss this? I muttered. Paul leaned forward. Blake, you've been busy. The company's been expanding. You've been working long hours. It's not your fault. I shook my head. No, it is my fault. I let my guard down. I trusted her. What do you want to do? Paul asked. I stood up, my resolve hardening. I want everything. Every photo, every video, every scrap of evidence you can get. I want to know every move they make, every word they say to each other. Paul nodded. Consider it done. What about Angelina? Are you going to confront her? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Not yet. Let her think she's getting away with it. When the time comes, I want her to know exactly how badly she screwed up. And Parker? Let him play his game for now. When we're ready, we'll take him down so hard he'll never be able to pull this scam again, I said, my voice cold with determination. Paul leaned back in his chair, a grim smile on his face. You got a plan brewing already, don't you? I nodded, my mind racing with possibilities. I always have a plan, Paul, but I need more information. Keep digging. I want to know everything about Jonathan's past cons, his weaknesses, his habits. And Angelina. I need to know exactly how deep she's in. What about the kids? Paul asked, his voice softening slightly. I felt a pang in my chest at the mention of Lily and Ben. They're my priority. Whatever happens, I need to protect them from this mess. Paul stood up, gathering the photos and documents. I'll keep you updated daily. And Blake, be careful. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Emotions? Paul, you know me better than that. This is business now, and in business, I never lose. As Paul left, I turned back to the window, watching the city below. My empire stretched out before me, a testament to my determination and cunning. I'd built it all from nothing, and I'd be damned if I'd let anyone, even Angelina, take it away from me. I picked up my phone, dialing my assistant. Sarah, clear my schedule for the next few days. And get me a meeting with Victoria Lawson as soon as possible. Yes, Mr. Thompson. Anything else? I paused, considering. Yes. I need you to discreetly gather all information on our family's finances, properties, everything. And Sarah? This stays between us. Of course, Mr. Thompson. You can count on me. As I hung up, I felt a cold resolve settling over me. The game had begun, and I intended to win, no matter the cost. I waited 3 days, gathering every piece of evidence, every scrap of information I could. When I felt ready, I put my plan into motion. Angelina, I called out as I entered our home. We need to talk. She appeared at the top of the stairs, a look of mild surprise on her face. Blake, you're home early. Is everything okay? I gestured to the living room. Let's sit down. There's something we need to discuss. As we settled onto the couch, I could see the nervousness in her eyes. She knew something was off. What's going on, Blake? You're scaring me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. Why don't you tell me, Angelina? Is there anything you want to confess? Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. Confess? I don't know what you're talking about. I laughed, a harsh sound that made her flinch. Really? Let me refresh your memory then. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos Paul had given me. I showed her one of her and Jonathan at a cafe, their hands intertwined on the table. Care to explain this? I asked, my voice cold. Angelina's face paled. Blake, it's not what it looks like. No? I swiped to the next photo, showing them entering the apartment building. How about this one? She stood up abruptly, pacing the room. Okay, fine. Yes, I've been seeing Jonathan. But it's not serious. It's just, I felt suffocated. Blake, you're always working, always focused on your empire. I needed something for myself. I stood up too, my anger barely contained. Something for yourself? And you thought cheating on your husband, betraying your family, was the answer? You don't understand, she cried, tears forming in her eyes. Jonathan makes me feel alive. He sees me, really sees me. And I don't. I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I, who gave you everything you could ever want, who built this life for you and our children. Angelina's tears were flowing freely now. It's not about things, Blake. It's about feeling valued, feeling loved. I laughed bitterly. Loved? Do you even know who Jonathan really is? Did you know his real name is Jonathan Reeves? That he's a con artist who preys on wealthy women? She shook her head frantically. No, you're lying. Jonathan would never. He would, and he has. I interrupted. I have proof of his past cons. He's using you, Angelina, for your money, your connections. Angelina collapsed back onto the couch, her face in her hands. I didn't know. I swear, Blake, I didn't know. I stood over her, my voice hard. It doesn't matter. You betrayed me, betrayed our family. And now you're going to face the consequences. She looked up at me, fear in her eyes. What do you mean? I'm filing for divorce, I said coldly. And I'm seeking full custody of Lily and Ben. Angelina gasped. No, Blake, please. You can't take my children away from me. I can and I will, I replied. I've already spoken to my lawyer. You'll be served with the papers tomorrow. She stood up, reaching for me. Blake, please. We can work this out. I'll end things with Jonathan. I'll do anything. Just please, don't do this. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. It's too late for that, Angelina. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. As I turned to leave the room, she called out, her voice desperate. What about the children? What are we going to tell them? I paused at the door. For now, nothing. They don't need to know about your betrayal. We'll tell them we're separating, that's all. And after that? She asked, her voice small. I looked back at her, my eyes cold. After that, you'll have limited supervised visitation, if you're lucky. As I walked away, I could hear her sobs echoing through the house. Part of me wanted to go back, to comfort her, to try to salvage what we had. But I squashed that impulse. She had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. I went to my study, locking the door behind me. I had calls to make, plans to set in motion. The war had begun, and I intended to win. The next morning, I met with Victoria Lawson in her sleek downtown office. Victoria was a force of nature, known for her ruthless efficiency and her personal vendetta against infidelity. Blake, she greeted me, her handshake firm. I've reviewed the evidence you sent over. You've got a strong case. I nodded, taking a seat across from her desk. I want to move quickly, Victoria. I need this handled as efficiently as possible. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Don't worry. I've already drafted the divorce papers. We'll file them today, citing adultery. As for custody, given the evidence of her affair and the potential danger posed by her companion, I believe we have a good shot at full custody. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked. Victoria tapped her pen against her desk. It depends on how much Angelina fights it. If she's smart, she'll realize she's outmatched and settle quickly. If not, well, I'm prepared for a battle. I smiled grimly. Knowing Angelina, she won't go down without a fight. Good, Victoria said, a predatory grin on her face. I like a challenge. Now, let's talk strategy. For the next hour, we went over every detail of our plan. Victoria was thorough, anticipating every possible move Angelina and her lawyer might make. What about Jonathan? I asked as our meeting was wrapping up. Can we use his criminal history against him in the custody battle? Victoria nodded. Absolutely. We'll paint him as a danger to the children. It'll strengthen our case for full custody. As I stood to leave, Victoria caught my arm. Blake, I know this is business for you, but it's personal for me. I've seen too many families destroyed by infidelity. I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you and your children come out of this on top. I met her gaze, seeing the determination there. Thank you, Victoria. I knew I could count on you. As I left her office, My phone buzzed with a message from Paul. Angelina's been served. She's meeting with her lawyer now. I smiled to myself. The game was on. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Jordan Mitchell, Angelina's lawyer. His voice was nervous as he spoke. Mr. Thompson, I'm calling on behalf of my client, Angelina. We've received your divorce petition and custody request. I was hoping we could discuss this amicably. I leaned back in my chair, my voice cold. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Mitchell. The terms are clear. If Angelina has any objections, we'll see her in court. But surely we can come to some sort of agreement, Jordan pressed. Full custody is quite extreme. Perhaps we could consider joint custody? I laughed humorlessly. Joint custody? With a woman who betrayed her family for a known con artist? I don't think so. My children's safety is my top priority. Mr. Thompson, please. Jordan's voice was almost pleading now. Think about what's best for the children. They need their mother. What's best for my children is to be protected from their mother's poor decisions, I replied firmly. If you have any other questions, direct them to my lawyer, Victoria Lawson. Good day, Mr. Mitchell. I hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction. Angelina had chosen an inexperienced lawyer, just as I'd hoped. This would make things much easier. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Angelina. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Blake, please. Her voice was thick with tears. Don't do this. We can work this out. I'll do anything. I closed my eyes, steeling myself against the emotion in her voice. It's too late for that, Angelina. You made your choice. But the children, she pleaded. They need me. You can't take them away from me. I'm doing what's best for them, I replied coldly. If you really cared about them, you would never have put them in this position. I made a mistake, she cried. Please, Blake, give me another chance. I felt my resolve harden. A mistake? Is that what you call repeatedly betraying your family? No, Angelina. There are no more chances. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. As I hung up, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me ached for the pain in her voice, for the family we once were. But a larger part, the part that had been hardened by years of fighting my way to the top, knew that this was necessary. In business and in life, there was no room for second chances when it came to betrayal. I turned back to my computer, pulling up the files on Jonathan that Paul had sent over. It was time to move on to the next phase of my plan. Jonathan Parker, or Reeves, or whatever his real name was about to learn what happened to those who dared to cross Blake Thompson. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind already racing with the day's plans. I had a series of meetings scheduled, each one a carefully placed domino in my grand scheme. First on the list was a breakfast meeting with Charles Worthington, the well-connected socialite who had hosted the gala where Angelina first met Jonathan. Blake, my dear fellow, Charles greeted me warmly as I sat down at our usual table at the Denver Country Club. To what do I owe the pleasure of this early morning rendezvous? I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Charles, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news to share. Charles leaned in, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Oh, do tell. It's about Angelina, I began, my voice low and controlled. And that artist, Jonathan Parker. Charles's eyebrows shot up. The new fellow? What about them? I pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I thought you should know. Jonathan Parker isn't who he claims to be. Charles opened the folder, his eyes widening as he scanned the contents. My word, he breathed. A con artist? And Angelina. She's involved with him? I nodded gravely. I'm afraid so. We're in the middle of divorce proceedings now. But Charles, I'm worried about the other women in our circle. Who knows how many of them Jonathan might try to target? Charles looked up at me, his face a mix of shock and determination. This is terrible, Blake. Simply terrible. What can I do to help? I leaned back, feigning reluctance. Well, I hate to ask, but perhaps you could discreetly spread the word? Just to protect our friends, of course. Charles nodded vigorously. Of course, of course. I'll make sure everyone knows to be on their guard. And Blake, I'm so sorry about Angelina. If there's anything I can do. I stood up, shaking his hand. Thank you, Charles. You're a true friend. As I left the country club, I could already hear Charles on his phone, no doubt spreading the news to his extensive network. By lunchtime, the entire Denver social scene would be buzzing with the scandal. My next stop was a meeting with Sandra Patel, a prominent local news anchor and an old friend. "Blake," Sandra greeted me with a hug. "It's been too long. What's this urgent news you wanted to discuss?" I sat down across from her, my face serious. "Sandra, I have a story for you. One that I think your viewers need to hear." Her eyes lit up with professional interest. "I'm listening." For the next hour, I laid out the whole sordid tale, painting Jonathan as a dangerous predator and Angelina as his unwitting victim. I watched as Sandra's expression shifted from shock to outrage to determination. "This is huge, Blake," she said when I finished. "A prominent businessman's wife seduced by a con artist. It's the kind of story that could really warn people about the dangers out there." I nodded solemnly. "That's why I came to you, Sandra. I trust you to handle this with the sensitivity it deserves." She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Of course, Blake. We'll run the story tonight. And I'm so sorry you're going through this." I gave her a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Sandra. Just knowing that we might prevent this from happening to someone else, it helps." As I left the news station, I felt a grim satisfaction. By nightfall, Jonathan's face would be plastered across every TV screen in Denver, his reputation in tatters. My final stop of the day was a meeting with my property manager, Jack. "Mr. Thompson," Jack greeted me nervously. "You wanted to see me about one of the properties?" I nodded, pulling out a file. "Yes, Jack. It's about the apartment building on 7th Street. I believe we have a tenant there who's been engaging in some unsavory activities." Jack frowned, looking at the file. "Jonathan Parker? But he's always paid his rent on time." "Unfortunately, Jack, Mr. Parker is not who he claims to be," I said, my voice stern. "I need you to evict him immediately. Today, if possible." Jack's eyes widened. "Today? But Mr. Thompson, the legal process for eviction usually takes—" I cut him off with a wave of my hand. "I'm aware of the usual process, Jack, but this is a special circumstance. Mr. Parker poses a danger to the other tenants. I'm sure if you explain the situation to him, he'll see the wisdom in leaving quietly." Jack nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. I'll take care of it right away." As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The pieces of my plan were falling into place. Jonathan's world was crumbling around him, and Angelina, well, she was about to learn the true cost of her betrayal. My phone buzzed with a message from Paul. "News story just broke. Jonathan's face is all over the media. His galleries already issued a statement distancing themselves from him." I smiled to myself. The public exposure was complete. Now, it was time for the final blow. The morning of Jonathan's big art show dawned bright and clear. I stood at my office window, watching the city come to life, a grim smile on my face. Today was the day Jonathan Parker would finally face the consequences of his actions. My phone buzzed. It was Paul. "Everything's set," he said without preamble. "The police are on standby. They'll move in as soon as we give the signal." "Good," I replied. "And the evidence?" "Rock solid. We've got proof of at least 3 separate instances of art fraud, plus his history of conning wealthy women." "He's going down, Blake." I nodded, even though Paul couldn't see me. "Excellent work, Paul. I'll see you at the gallery." As I hung up, there was a knock at my office door. It was Victoria. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. I stood up, straightening my tie. "More than ready. It's time Jonathan learned what happens when you cross Blake Thompson." Victoria smiled, a predatory grin that matched my own. "I almost feel sorry for him." Almost. We arrived at the gallery just as the show was getting underway. The place was packed, Denver's elite mingling and sipping champagne as they admired Jonathan's artwork. I spotted him across the room, charming a group of potential buyers. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw a flicker of unease cross his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. "Mr. Thompson," he said, approaching me with false bravado, "I'm surprised to see you here. I wouldn't have thought this was your scene." I smiled coldly. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world, Jonathan. Or should I say, Mr. Reeves?" His face paled slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. No? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, perhaps these gentlemen can explain it to you. On cue, two plainclothes detectives approached, flanking Jonathan. Jonathan Parker, also known as Jonathan Reeves, one of them said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. You're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud and grand larceny. The gallery fell silent as the detective continued reading Jonathan his rights. I watched with satisfaction as the realization of what was happening dawned on his face. You can't do this, Jonathan hissed at me as the detectives handcuffed him. You have no proof. I leaned in close, my voice low. I have everything, Jonathan. Every con, every lie, every piece of fraudulent art you've ever sold. It's over. As the detectives led him away, the gallery erupted into shocked whispers. I caught snippets of conversation around me. Can you believe it? I almost bought one of his paintings. What about poor Angelina Thompson? I allowed myself a small smile. Everything was going according to plan. Victoria appeared at my side, a glass of champagne in her hand. Quite a show, she said, her eyes gleaming. I don't think he'll be conning anyone else for a very long time. I nodded, taking the glass she offered. No, he won't. But this is just the beginning, Victoria. We're not done yet. She raised an eyebrow. Angelina? Angelina, I confirmed, and anyone else who thought they could take advantage of me or my family. As we left the gallery, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. Jonathan's downfall was complete, his reputation in tatters, his freedom forfeit. But there was still work to be done. Angelina and her family were about to learn that crossing Blake Thompson came with a steep price. The next morning, I was in my office early, reviewing the latest financial reports when my phone rang. It was Richard, Angelina's father. Thompson, he barked as soon as I answered. We need to talk. Now. I leaned back in my chair, a small smile playing on my lips. Richard, to what do I owe the pleasure? Cut the crap, he snapped. I know what you're doing. The divorce, the custody battle, the public humiliation. It ends now. You hear me? I chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. Or what, Richard? Or I'll destroy you, he threatened. I've got connections you can't even imagine. I'll bury your company so deep you'll never recover. I sat up straighter, my voice turning cold. Is that so? Well, Richard, I think you're about to learn a very important lesson about making threats you can't back up. What are you talking about? He demanded. Check your stock portfolio, I said calmly. I think you'll find it makes for some interesting reading. There was silence on the other end of the line, then the sound of furious typing. After a moment, I heard Richard's sharp intake of breath. What have you done? He whispered, shock evident in his voice. I smiled grimly. I've done exactly what you threatened to do to me, Richard. Your company's stock is in freefall. Your investments? Worthless. And it's all traceable back to some very poor decisions made by your board of directors. Decisions they made based on information from a trusted source. You bastard, Richard hissed. How dare you? No, Richard. I cut him off. How dare you threaten me? How dare you and your daughter think you could betray me and walk away unscathed? This is the price of crossing Blake Thompson. I'll fight this, he sputtered. You'll do nothing, I interrupted. Because if you try, I'll release evidence of your company's less than legal dealings in emerging markets. How do you think your shareholders would react to that? The line went silent for a long moment. When Richard spoke again, his voice was defeated. What do you want? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, I said coldly. I want you to look at your daughter and remember that her choices led to this. And I want you to disappear from my life and the lives of my children. Permanently. Without waiting for a response, I hung up. I knew it wouldn't be long before Angelina heard about what had happened. Sure enough, barely an hour later, my office door burst open. Angelina stormed in, her face a mask of fury and desperation. How could you? She cried, slamming her hands on my desk. My father's company, our family's legacy. You've destroyed it all. I looked up at her calmly. I did what was necessary to protect myself and our children, Angelina. Your father made the mistake of threatening me. This isn't protection, Blake, she spat. This is revenge. Pure and simple. I stood up, meeting her gaze. Call it what you want. But remember, you started this when you decided to betray our family. Angelina's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a look of despair. What am I supposed to do now? You've taken everything. The children, our home, and now my family's business. You'll do what you should have done from the beginning, I said coldly. You'll face the consequences of your actions. She stared at me, tears welling in her eyes. I never thought you could be this cruel, Blake. I laughed humorlessly. Cruel? I gave you everything, Angelina. A home, a family, security. And you threw it all away for a con artist. This isn't cruelty. This is justice. Angelina shook her head, backing away from my desk. You're wrong, Blake. This isn't justice. This is you becoming the very thing you always feared. A man so consumed by power and control that he's lost sight of what really matters. As she turned to leave, I called after her. What matters is loyalty, Angelina. Something you seem to have forgotten. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in my office. I sat back down, staring out at the Denver skyline. I had won, I told myself. I had protected what was mine and punished those who had wronged me. So why did victory taste so bitter? Months passed. The divorce was finalized, with me retaining full custody of Lily and Ben. Angelina, last I heard, had moved back in with her parents, her life in shambles. Jonathan was serving time for his fraudulent schemes. I threw myself into my work and into caring for the children. But despite my best efforts, there was an emptiness I couldn't shake. One afternoon, as I was leaving a business lunch, I quite literally ran into her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, scrambling to pick up the papers she'd dropped. I knelt to help her. No, it was my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going. As we stood, our eyes met. She was beautiful, with warm brown eyes and a kind smile. "I'm Julia," she said, extending her hand. "Blake," I replied, shaking it. "Blake Thompson." Her eyes widened slightly with recognition, but to her credit, she didn't react beyond that. "Well, Blake Thompson," she said with a small smile, "since you nearly knocked me over, the least you can do is buy me a coffee to make up for it." I found myself smiling back, something I hadn't done in months. "I think that's fair. Shall we?" Over coffee, I found myself opening up to Julia in a way I hadn't with anyone in a long time. She was a child psychologist, intelligent and compassionate. When I mentioned Lily and Ben, her eyes lit up. "They sound wonderful," she said warmly. "It must be challenging, raising them on your own." I nodded, surprised by her lack of judgment. "It is, but they're worth it." As we parted ways that afternoon, Julia handed me her card. "If you ever want to talk about the kids or anything else, give me a call." I found myself calling her the very next day. Over the following weeks, we began to see each other regularly. Julia was different from anyone I'd ever known. She was strong and independent, but also kind and understanding. She didn't shy away from my past or my complexities. One evening, as we were having dinner at my place after putting the kids to bed, Julia turned to me with a serious expression. "Blake," she said softly, "I need to know something." I tensed, preparing myself for the worst. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. All this pain, all this revenge, was it worth it? I was silent for a long moment, considering her question. Finally, I spoke. At the time, I thought it was. I thought it would make things right, would balance the scale somehow. But now... Julia reached out, taking my hand. "And now?" I sighed, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as I admitted the truth. "Now, I'm not so sure. I protected my children, my legacy. But at what cost?" Julia squeezed my hand gently. "It's not too late to change, Blake. To be the man, the father, you really want to be." I looked at her, seeing the warmth and acceptance in her eyes. "Will you help me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, leaning in to kiss me softly, every step of the way. In the months that followed, with Julia's support, I began to rebuild not just my life, but myself. I reached out to Angelina, arranging for her to have regular visitation with the children. It wasn't easy, but seeing the joy on Lily and Ben's faces when they saw their mother made it worth it. I even took steps to help Richard's company recover, anonymously funneling business their way through shell companies. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. One sunny afternoon, Julia and I took the kids to the park. As I watched Lily push Ben on the swings, Julia's hand in mine, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "You've come a long way," Julia said, smiling up at me. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "We all have. There's still a long way to go, but I think we're on the right path." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, I gathered Lily and Ben close. With Julia by my side, I looked at my little family and made a silent vow. The cycle of revenge and bitterness ended here. From now on, we would move forward with love, understanding, and above all, loyalty to each other. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still challenges ahead, wounds that needed time to heal. But as we walked home together, hand in hand, I knew that we would face whatever came our way as a family. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.